This content is brought to you by Uphold, which is a great platform that makes crypto investing easy. You can buy, sell, trade, and earn cryptocurrencies on Uphold. They have 10 plus million users, over 200 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. I personally use this platform since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. They also offer equities and precious metals that you can invest in. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Brian Quintenz, who's the head of policy at a16z Crypto and a former CFTC commissioner. Brian, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Tony. It's great to be with you. It's been a little while since we last visited. I think we were talking, it's been over a year, which, you know, how long is that in crypto years? But it's wonderful to be back. And thanks for all your great work in the space, you know, raising the awareness of these important issues to the community.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, it's just great to have you back. And I saw your new role on LinkedIn. I was like, I got to get Brian back on because there's lots to talk about. And you, of course, have a plethora of experience in DC working as part of the CFTC and so forth. Before we get into everything that's going on with crypto, congratulations and tell us about your new position.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, I couldn't be more excited about this. When I left the CFTC, I was thinking about, you know, what I wanted my, you know, future career to look like. I always wanted to keep crypto relevant because I believed in the promise of it. I believed in the underlying technology, and I spent a lot of time trying to, you know, discuss those benefits in public fora and in public venues. But there were a number of things in which I was interested in, and I had the opportunity to join a16z Crypto as an outside advisor right after leaving, which I thought was a wonderful way to get exposure to the space, to increase my awareness of all of the different innovations that are occurring and what founders are building, and learn from, I think, you know, the best team in the business and those that have, you know, incredible foresight and understanding of what's happening. And then over time, I became so convinced by their thesis of what this technology and what crypto can become, what it can empower over, you know, people's ownership over their participation in networks, people's ownership over their digital intellectual property, their ownership over their digital identities, you know, the efficiencies in payments and exchanges of value. As well as just feeling like I was joining a world-class team, that I realized this was the thing I wanted to do, and it fit really my philosophy, which is that the future is built by founders and innovators.
Yeah.
And as I got exposure to this firm, one of the things that I realized that is paramount in their culture is basically treating founders as sacred. You know, so the people that are spending their nights and weekends, you know, all their waking hours, oftentimes sacrificing time with their family, their friends, you know, giving up their hobbies to build the things that we are all going to use. And this is a firm that I saw that put that at the top of their priority list, that wanted to be with founders, you know, through the good times and the bad times, and that recognized that innovation and entrepreneurship are kind of the founding benchmarks of what our future can become. And I couldn't be more excited to be a part of that. And it's a critical time to actually be in the policy space in the crypto ecosystem. So I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, I mean, and we were talking before the recording, what a place to be, you know, as a techie. I've followed Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz and those folks since Web 1.0 and dealing with search engines. And obviously there's Web 2.0 and now they're in Web 3. It's amazing how things have grown and the technology has changed. And we're at a crossroads point where we need to get it right in the US for fostering innovation and you know, have the economic benefits from that. So a lot took place last year. There were a lot of collapses, a lot of issues, Celsius, FTX, you name it. You know, what are your thoughts on just the situations and the next steps for us this year?
Yeah, so I guess let me start by maybe talking about what we think are, our priorities and what the roadmap is, and then I'd be happy to go into kind of the lay of the land and what those events that you mentioned I think have meant, or how that has affected the landscape.
Hmm.
I think you're right to point out that this is a fundamental advancement of technology, right? This is ushering in the next generation of the internet, and we need policy that respects that.
Hmm.
We need if we're going to have responsible innovation, we need responsible policy, and the two need to go hand in hand, right? If you have irresponsible innovation, you're going to end up with irresponsible policy, and if you have irresponsible policy, you're going to push people offshore, and they're going to take advantage of the system and make less competitive those that are here in the United States or in other jurisdictions that are advancing irresponsible policy, that are trying to follow the rules. So first and foremost, we need to advocate for and achieve policy that respects this technology and its promise. We
Right.
also need to do that on a bipartisan basis. And we need to do that working with various agencies so that we can create an enduring and lasting and appropriately calibrated regulatory regime that recognizes all of those benefits. And I think Web3 is one of those rare policy, conversations that can bridge the political spectrum.
Hmm.
We see people on the extremes of the political spectrum embracing aspects of Web3 and embracing aspects of crypto. And I think that is hugely important, especially in the age in which we live, where political lines are hardening and everything seems to be politicized, and it's hard to take a view on an issue without being attacked by someone on the opposite side of the aisle with a different perspective. And I think that this is a great time to be spreading that message across the political spectrum. And lastly, I think all perspectives need to be considered to develop that enduring long-term set of solutions, and ultimately regulations, and if done by themselves or if advanced through legislation, need to focus on who can comply, how they can comply, and if complying actually makes sense with the risks that they pose. And our framework for that is regulating businesses, not regulating software, right? Potentially regulating businesses that are applications, not regulating software that are protocols. Across those different landscapes, who can comply, whether or not they should, and how those regulations are calibrated to address the appropriate and specific risks to the technology and how they operate. So that's kind of our roadmap. I think back to your point about what we've seen over the last year, and especially over the last couple months. I mean, obviously, FTX specifically is a terrible situation.
Yeah.
It's affected a huge number of people in a highly negative way, and I mean that's really it's just really awful. And I think the crypto ecosystem needs to build back some trust. I think that there are those. One of the things that I think has happened is that some of these events have kind of hardened positions on each end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. You have crypto antagonists that are using these events to, reinforce their views and spread their message that this is all basically fraud and all basically a Ponzi scheme. And I think you have a lot of us on the other side of that spectrum who have embraced decentralization because of the benefits that it has, because of the promise that it can present to individuals to own their contributions and own their intellectual property, because of how it solves legacy, financial risks and the underlying rationale for policy and for regulatory rule sets. That what we have seen in DeFi is completely the opposite of what occurred in FTX and in Celsius and in Voyager, because you don't have that centralization, you don't have those conflicts of interest. And that's another important point, is that what we have seen is not unique to crypto.
Right.
And it has no bearing on the underlying technology, and it has no relationship to Web3. What has been reported is that at least in FTX's case, seems to be classic fraud. And we have seen that throughout financial history, where, centralized firms and bad actors take advantage of the fact that they sit at the center of very large amounts of money and the exchange of value. And, again, to kind of, throw out crypto because of the, bad actions of a few centralized actors would basically, be the equivalent of saying, well, we should eliminate the entire financial system because of Bernie Madoff.
Right.
You go after the fraudsters, you go after those that are acting in bad faith. And hopefully, clear regulatory solutions will provide that. They'll provide very strong guideposts. And a16z has been calling for this for a long time. We've been calling for clear regulation. That's one of the absolute reasons why I wanted to join this firm as an advisor and join them full time. That clear regulation is definitely needed in the US. More thoughtful, clear regulatory guidance is going to protect retail investors, but give precise direction to founders and builders that want to follow the right path. And it's going to encourage that development from happening it's going to encourage that development happening here in the US.
For sure. And you made some great points there where, a lot of the issues that took place last year are not exclusive to crypto. They've happened in the traditional financial markets. And it could be, well, at least from my perspective, be argued that those collapses happened because the regulators didn't move fast enough, because Congress didn't move fast enough. They let crypto, the innovation flourish, but also hadn't put the guardrails in place. And now it seems everybody's scrambling to say, okay, we got to get this done ASAP.
Yeah, and I think look, if you look across, the crypto spectrum and ecosystem, there are certainly, centralized firms that are offering products that are very similar to highly regulated, instruments. And then there are plenty of firms and tons of tokens that are being offered that have utility, that are achieving decentralization, that have use cases, and that don't have those legacy centralization concerns or present kind of the idea of asymmetric information. And that's one of the key focal points of regulation, where asymmetric information exists between a centralized firm and how it can run its operations, and investors in those businesses or consumers of those products. Regulation is kind of the verify component of the trust but verify system. But there's a huge swath of the ecosystem where those challenges aren't present and to some degree are being solved for by transparent and open protocols that people can access, use, understand, and that are open source. And that have risk management built into them so that people can understand exactly what they're getting. And you're right. I mean, I think it's astonishing to me that it's been 4 years since we've gotten, you and I were talking about how long it's been since you and I talked, and that was just a year ago. It's been 4 years since the SEC produced any guidance on this, any guidance at all. And, the idea that everything is out of compliance and everyone should come in and register with an outdated regime that doesn't fit the technology, doesn't allow for crypto to actually trade in the way that it does, and could constitute an effective ban on it, is not a productive solution. And I think that that's what we need. We need productive, thoughtful legislation and regulation that can embrace the benefits of the promise of this technology while also protecting consumers from risk. And, to the extent that any agency wants to go after those that are centralized, present risk to investors, and are offering, the exact same kinds of products that are regulated, I think that's a fair case to be made. But we're seeing, regulators kind of pile on after bad things have happened, that haven't provided, the consumers with, the appropriate protections, that they wanted. And I think there are plenty of cases where, some folks should have known better, given some early indications of how some of these products were viewed. But there also needs to be work done so that if they do need to register, that registration allows them to operate. You can't have a situation where you either come in and register and go out of business, or you get enforced after the fact, after you're already out of business. I'm not sure how that presents any kind of opportunity to realize the benefits of the technology.
Yeah, and we've seen a couple of situations with that. One more recently with Digital Currency Group and Gemini, where the SEC comes in after the fact. But how does that help the users who can't access their funds from Gemini earn. Finding Gemini just takes money out of their pockets to help restore those funds. So it just seems backwards. And the other aspect to this is Sam Bankman-Fried, of course, was meeting with the SEC and I think the CFTC as well. So I'm just looking at him like, where did this all go wrong? Because he came in as he was encouraged to by, folks at the SEC come in and talk to us. Well, why wasn't there due diligence done on the regulator side? And maybe, Brian, you being part of the CFTC before can shed some light on that. Take us behind the curtain. How did it not catch what was happening?
Yeah, so I can speak from my experience and my awareness of the CFTC process. I'm not aware of what was happening at the SEC, and I think it's important for that to, see the light of day so that people know exactly what kind of conversations happen, what was being advocated for, and what was being considered. I think, if like one-off, regulatory exemptions that could basically have created a de facto monopoly, were under discussion, I think that would be something that would be very disturbing.
Yeah.
And I hope that's not the case, but I think that whatever was happening, I think there needs to be some light shed on that. From my involvement at the CFTC, FTX and SBF's I think touch point to the agency basically came right after I left, when they purchased a regulated derivatives exchange, a CFTC regulated derivatives exchange known as LedgerX, that became FTX US Derivatives. And once they purchased that licensed entity, which was a futures marketplace, a swaps marketplace, and that had the CFTC version of a broker dealer called a future commission merchant, I believe. No, it wasn't a future commission; it was a DCO, a clearing organization that would clear those products. Then it was part of the regulatory fold, and just like any regulated entity, I would expect and I would want an agency and regulators to have ongoing dialogue with those that are operating regulated entities, so that the agency understands what they're doing, the firms understand what the agency's concerns are or the direction that it's going. If there are rules, or guidance that the agency is thinking about issuing, that it accepts all kinds of feedback from all various kinds of entities about that. And so, that doesn't necessarily surprise me. And on its surface, it doesn't necessarily, to me, seem in any way inappropriate. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think it's absolutely appropriate for the agency to seek to have those conversations with regulated entities. And I think it's also important to note, I think, into your question of where did this go wrong, or could it have been seen more clearly? There apparently was a line between FTX US / FTX.com, and the CFTC regulated derivatives entities. In fact, part of the CFTC rule set for derivatives exchanges and clearing organizations is that they do segregate customer funds, for customers themselves. And they have real-time auditing capabilities to ensure that those customer funds are being segregated. And that's come online because of issues that the agency had seen and that the futures industry had experienced, where those customer funds had not been segregated. We saw that in the blow up of MF Global. We saw that in the blow up of Revco. And so the agency spent a lot of time developing capabilities to verify in real time that customer assets were segregated. And as a result of that, the U.S. derivative entities that were regulated by the CFTC, were solvent and are now being sold. I think they were just cleared for sale in the bankruptcy process. So, could more have been done to try to unearth and uncover connections between FTX US Derivatives and other entities? I'm not sure. Could more have been done on the CFTC side to explore in more detail FTX.com? Possibly. But I think, to the extent that, FTX.com was engaging US customers, which apparently it was, I think that that's kind of an open question for all regulators.
Mm. Yeah, and maybe I understand some of this is new territory, but I guess in the future, if there is an outside international exchange before they even try to come set up something in the US, I guess the regulators have to take it to the next step, and that is, okay, show us your books for that international um, business and what you're planning to do, right? It's just
I
another
mean, I
layer.
think, sorry, that's a really important point, and I think we saw that when I was at the CFTC, where you had similar to FTX, you had other international unregulated or lightly regulated crypto exchanges, many offering, large marketplaces in derivatives contracts, use the resources that they had accumulated to try to buy U.S. entities. And the statute that the CFTC follows didn't have a review process in it to verify or research or in any way acknowledge that these were, good actors. It was much more of a cursory process, and the agency does have to follow the law. And if Congress says this is your review process, that's the review process. And I think in a recent hearing, Senator Gillibrand from New York raised a very good point about that. Do you need more authority to review, the solvency and good faith acting by entities that are seeking to acquire U.S.-based regulated venues? And I think the response to that by Chairman Benham was yes, I think we do. And so, that's a very legitimate concern. But I also think it's really important to bring this back to a policy perspective, which is if you have a productive, well thought through, appropriately calibrated regulatory regime in the United States, especially for centralized entities, then you're going to increase, the attractiveness of those entities to institutional clients, to U.S. retail, and make them more safe and sound, protect customers, increase market integrity. So, in my view, the way to solve this is by appropriately calibrating a new regulatory regime for certainly at least for centralized exchanges, so that they can receive the benefit of being regulated. If that regime is uncalibrated or poorly calibrated, or creates huge kinds of costs, then you're doing the exact opposite, and you're perpetuating the status quo that's going to disadvantage U.S. entities from competing and attracting consumers and clients and investors into a regulated venue that has integrity.
When you mention regime, are you referencing a new government agency that maybe it's a combination of SEC and CFTC officials and other regulatory agencies where they are coming together to work specifically on crypto? Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah. So I think as we may have discussed before, and as you may have discussed a lot since, commodities themselves are not regulated at the federal level from a market regulatory perspective. The CFTC does have anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authority over spot commodity transactions, but that's an after-the-fact enforcement authority, not a preemptive regulatory authority. And so, to the extent that many of these tokens are indeed commodities, have functionality, have achieved, some level of decentralization that resolves asymmetric information discrepancies between consumers and management teams, then I think, in order to create a regime that brings in crypto exchanges, to it, new legislation is going to have to be passed that decides, what the appropriate regulator is for that and what those rules should look like. And that's important because eventually Congress is going to have to decide that. I think, they need to decide that as long as it's, again, appropriately calibrated and productive. They need to decide that. I'm optimistic that they can. Mm-hmm. I think we have wonderful knowledgeable members of Congress that really understand this technology and its benefits, as well as some of its risks, in positions of authority in this incoming Congress, that I think want also to have well thought through regulation. And I'm really optimistic that I think, this could be a year where we see that, which gets back to what I said in the beginning, that this is a critical time for crypto and we're at a policy crossroads.
For sure, yeah, and to your point, I've been seeing that both sides of the aisle, there are folks coming in and working together. Darren Soden, Warren Davidson, Senator Gillibrand, and Lummis as well. So hopefully this year they can get it right. I know stablecoin regulation has been on the higher side of the priority list. Do you think we see both stablecoin regulations as well as comprehensive crypto regulations?
So it's impossible to predict, but I think you're right. I think those are kind of the two priority items, for Congress to consider. It seems to have been where most of the work has been done. I think we've seen productive approaches to stablecoin regulation that have been introduced on a bipartisan basis. I know there have been a lot of ongoing conversations between Congress and the administration on how to achieve that. I think to me, it's a little interesting. Some of those conversations focus on, legacy policy and regulatory issues like a state regime versus a federal regime. Which federal regulator should have that authority? So even beyond an appropriately calibrated regulatory, model for stablecoins, there are bigger policy questions that have to be answered about making those kinds of choices. But I think those can be resolved. And I think we've seen solutions for that. And I think they're kind of top of mind. But as I think you and I may have discussed before, Congress was not created to enact laws. Congress was created to ensure that bad ideas did not become law, which is why there are so many obstacles to, moderate legislation, and why there are so many procedural mechanisms that require a consensus to ultimately pass something into law. And so it is very difficult to pass a law, and we can't underestimate how difficult that is, even with things being as much of a priority as they are in these two instances.
I want to talk specifically about the CFTC and situations that they've had with Tornado Cash as well as Ooki DAO. What are your thoughts on how the CFTC has been handling those situations?
Yeah, so I think privacy preserving software, I think, is going to be it's going to be a place where there's going to be a lot of discussions happening around what the best approach is that both respects the law as it currently is, from a sanctions regime perspective, as well as the law as it exists around respecting people's privacy. And I'm of the view that I think privacy preserving software is critical. And I actually think, and I think we think, it can have a huge benefit to dissuading bad actors from committing cyber crimes and trying to steal value. If they know it's going to be very, very difficult to identify who people are, right, then and a lot of those assets aren't necessarily in one specific honeypot, right? There are a lot of advantages that can have to deterring illicit finance activities and deterring cyber theft. On the Ooki DAO case, I think we have to see how that evolves. It is ongoing. It is an ongoing court case. I think a lot of the claims in the complaint that the CFTC filed against the Ooki DAO did not have significant legal justification to them. They were not satisfactorily explained. I think they made a lot of determinative statements without support, and have just recently filed for a default judgment because no one from the Ooki DAO, showed up to defend themselves. A16z Crypto did file an amicus brief around the service of process issue. That was mostly focused on, how a DAO could be served, whether or not appropriate notice was given. Could an agency, deliver something to a chat room and have that be sufficient notice? And our focus was, that a lawful purpose has to be established to recognize a group of people as an unincorporated association, which was the legal classification that the CFTC gave to the Ooki DAO. And we didn't see any kind of acknowledgement that it was established for a legal purpose. I think in the decision that the judge handed down on service, where the judge thought service was appropriately given, the judge acknowledged that a number of the issues raised, not in our amicus, but in other amici briefs that were filed, were more appropriate to be decided, in the actual trial. And so, to me, it would be, incredibly unfortunate if such broad, and unsubstantiated accusations with, lines of liability that extend, in my view, to very unreasonable places about someone voting at any time on anything in a DAO being responsible for any kind of future regulatory violation. It would be very unfortunate if just through process, the agency was able to cement those views through a default judgment. So we'll have to see how that evolves. I'm pretty disappointed in the approach to that case. I think those kinds of policy issues either need to be adjudicated in court or, more appropriately, need to be discussed, by the agency at the commission level.
Sure.
I think they need to do rulemakings on this. They need to provide guidance on this. They need to have discussions on this. They have advisory committees at the agencies where opinions from the public can be heard and discussed and informed. And none of those have happened on this issue. And I think it also reinforces our view that DAOs are going to need some kind of legal wrapper.
Sure.
That allows them to do things like appropriately pay taxes, hire service providers, enter into contracts, while also, like exists in legacy limited liability, company formations and unincorporated association law, some, liability shields for individual members. And that's a state level solution that we've developed some thinking on. Miles Jennings, the general counsel of a16z Crypto, and David Kerr have put out a number of papers on those, on that concept. And that's something that we're exploring at the state level, so that a DAO, especially one associated with a protocol, could achieve, some level of regulatory oversight, or and have some level of business operations like paying taxes and like hiring service providers and contracting, while also ensuring that liability doesn't extend to anybody at any time for anything.
Yeah, look, I know the regulators got a tough job. There's a lot of new things, a lot of new technology, but man, I hope they get it right this year. And instead of having the knee-jerk reactions, and they really sit down and think about these things, and look at how they can have a balanced approach, because there just seems to be a lot of regulation by enforcement, and hopefully we can move away from that approach and a more not non-heavy-handed approach.
Yeah, I mean, and look, enforcement is a very valuable tool for regulators, and I think we all need to acknowledge that. But like anything, it can be abused, and in some cases, it's unproductive. And it's unproductive where an agency has an established policy, has an established guidance, and this is, I think, a criticism through the Ooki DAO case that you could level at the CFTC. I think it's a fair criticism of the SEC, where you come in after the fact and prosecute, maybe the worst actor, but set a very, very broad precedent upon which no policy debate has occurred, which is why I think it is likely, but also critical, that Congress come in and dictate, guidelines and statutory authority to an agency or multiple agencies about how to approach this technology, so that investors and consumers can be protected, right? The benefits of the technology can flourish. You can have market integrity, and solve, especially in areas where a number of the existing, regulatory touch points are solved for.
For sure. So you touched a lot on what a16z's roadmap is, and filing amicus briefs and so forth. Is there anything else? Are you guys doing any type of education, trying to help folks in DC to understand this technology, not to be scared of it, not to have a knee-jerk reaction to it? Are you doing that type of work as well?
Oh, absolutely, we are. And I think that's a critical role for us to do. I think it's a critical role for everybody in the ecosystem to do. And I think one of the most powerful things that I have seen, we have seen, is when the founders and builders come in and explain what they're doing, because it provides, real world tangible use cases for these things. And I think they have instant credibility because they're the ones that are, again, dedicating their lives and sacrificing their time to building innovative products that hopefully we can all use in the future because they better our lives. And yes, but broadly speaking, I spoke before about how I think some of the negative events that we've seen over the last couple months and even year has kind of hardened the ends of the spectrum. I think there's a vulnerable population in the middle that may be somewhat crypto skeptical, not necessarily in an inherently antagonistic way, but crypto skeptical, not very knowledgeable, but willing to acknowledge that there are benefits, to the technology and to the products and to the use cases. And I think some of those events have maybe pushed them into more of the hardened skeptic camp, or at least, reaffirm some of that skepticism. And we need to educate them and either, get them back on the fence or bring them back over. And again, through showing them that these are legacy issues that have existed in financial services for eternity, right? They're the reason why regulations exist, but we see a complete difference in approach and significant nuance in the spectrum of the ecosystem, from centralization to decentralization, from interior closed systems to things being on-chain, transparent, done through open source code, right? And so that is our job to educate, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to be a part of this team and to accept some of that responsibility, is to help educate. And we've actually hired our first head of government affairs, Colin McCune, who is doing a fantastic job doing that on the Hill, and I look forward to joining him in those conversations along with regulators.
So, final question here for you. Despite all the things that happened last year with the collapses, we saw some of the biggest names enter the crypto market and industry, such as BlackRock, and launching a Bitcoin spot trust. They're doing, I think they launched an ETF in Europe as well. NASDAQ launched crypto custody, BNY Mellon. Do you think those folks, or those names and those caliber of financial institutions coming in could help, bring the folks who are scared away, or those in DC who are like, oh, I don't want to touch this right now, could help bring them back in and, put their minds at ease at least?
I don't know. I mean, I think to one degree, when you have large legacy, financial institutions actively exploring, if not dipping their toes into the water, it can provide some level of credibility to those that were very skeptical. Although there's a converse outcome, which is that it could reinforce the view that this is all financial in nature. It's all trading. It could reinforce some people's views of Wall Street as a casino. And I think it could be a double-edged sword, but I for one am happy to see it. I think what it recognizes, or what's important to recognize about it, is that those institutions would not be doing that if they didn't have strong demand from their customers to offer those products.
Sure.
So that's, to me, what it means. It means they are seeing from their customers, a strong interest in having these products being offered to them. And I think that's a great thing to recognize, that this isn't just kind of top of the house trying to get ahead of trends. I think a lot of it's coming, from the bottom up. And so, we'll have to see how that evolves. And, it'd be interesting to have, those folks' perspectives. But again, I think there are plenty of aspects of this technology and a lot of the benefits that currently exist in it, where a lot of those intermediaries and centralization issues aren't necessarily needed. And people can access these kinds of things on their own. And they can, take charge of their lives, and they can, own things themselves and custody things themselves. And, I'm excited for people to, explore the benefits of that as well, as opposed to only through, traditional financial institutions.
Yeah, great point. That even though they're coming in, the point of Web3 is to, be your own bank and have ownership of your identity and your finances and so forth. And you can self-custody and own your own data on the blockchain. And with the future of token economy, maybe you control who gets to see that data, and you can profit off of it if you choose to. It is kind of a brave new world of things that we can do.
Yeah, yeah, and I think realizing those benefits is going to ensure that crypto turns into the world computer and not the world casino. And I think that's what we're really focused on. There's always going to be a financialization aspect to things that have value and where large value accumulates. But we are really trying to push the idea that this is the next iteration of the internet, and we need to recognize how important that could be, not only to broad-based economic growth, but also to individuals.
Brian, always a pleasure chatting with you. I have to have you back on because, things will progress this year, and we'll definitely get your perspective. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Tony. It's great to see you again. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to coming back.